annual fundraiser by honoring local poets every year. So I happen to be, I'm not saying this because I happen to be one of the honorees this year, but Rick Lowe, those of you who know, who did Project Row Houses, and is also honored this year. And so they have their fundraiser party, and you know, maybe Anna will say just a couple of words about that for everybody, if there's any invitations or...
So, as Fady mentioned, I work for Voices Breaking Boundaries, and we have a fundraiser coming up. Fady is one of 5 honorees. We're celebrating our 15th year in Houston. It's our quinceañera. So we're honoring Lisa Harris, who's an opera singer, Paul Hester, who's a photographer, Fady, Rick Lowe, and Delilah Montoya. One of our former honorees is here as well, Gwen Zepeda. She was last year's honoree. So if you're interested in attending, you can go to our website at vbbarts.org. Tickets are for one person $115, for a couple it's $175. It's $115 in honor of our 15th year. So if you're interested in attending or volunteering and getting free tickets, you can do that as well. And it's the same way, just go to our website. And thank you, Fady, for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
So, you know, I will just, Harvey and I know each other from a few years back, and I'll just want to take the conversation in a normal or flowing sense, and maybe we'll get to a point where we can just have questions and you can respond to them. So I just discussed with you before we started this quote that I always found interesting by Hannah Arendt in The Social Question, where she mentions that unlike political democracy, where representation through election is necessary, science and poetry, in particular she mentions poetry, are exempt from the democratic process. We can understand that about science. So it's just an interesting, point to bring up. We can understand that about science. Right? There is no democratic process about science. You either figure something out or you don't figure it out, and everybody jumps on the... But about poetry, she says, the poets, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, who survive time, if you will, are those who are voted in not by the word of masters, the fiat of masters, the word fiat uses, but actually by those who are readers of poetry, are lovers of poetry, and are incapable of writing a single line. It's a very harsh sentence, and I wonder if it is also outdated, or to what extent is it outdated, and what does it mean? Like somebody told me, well, you know, Hannah Arendt doesn't mean that she's always right. But what do you think about this? Because this is certainly not the way we think about poetry in a public space. Right. Hannah Arendt spent much of her writing about the idea of politics in a public space, polis. And so I was wondering, with all this conversation that we usually centers around this notion of poetry in relationship to the public space, and I just wanted sort of you to riff off on that as a starter.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a very, very interesting question, and the Arendt quote, which I hadn't known about until you mentioned it, reminds me of Joseph Brodsky in his essay collection called Less Than One, makes a very similar claim that neither science nor art is democratic. And I wonder whether things are quite so clear as all of that. So, for instance, you know, I have family members who think that there should be essentially a democratic decision about things like evolution. And so the claim is that it deserves equal time in the same way that whatever other thing we would normally think of as part of this civic domain. And so the sense is that scientific theories have a kind of right to that same version of equality. So it seems like it's a little bit of a troublesome notion in that way. And the Arendt passage also makes me think about all the ways in which poets have tried to get hold of the acuity and the exactitude and frankly the prestige of science. Zukowski and Pound and so many of the modernists very much wanting to claim poetry as a science. So it does seem as though it's there's a little bit of a gray area in addition to the sort of clear division of separation of science and art from other sorts of things, but it certainly it draws attention to the degree to which art is reciprocal with the audience. And so if I'm a lab scientist and I discover whatever, I would discover a new bacterium, it doesn't matter whether anybody likes it or not. It doesn't matter whether anybody cares. It's the facts are the facts, the data is the data. But if I write poems that nobody cares about, then nobody cares about them. And that's an important, that's very important about the poems. It may not be the only deciding factor. There are plenty of people who wrote plenty of poems that nobody cared about at the time that we now care about later. A lot. But there's a very interesting kind of reciprocity that is truly reciprocity between poet, poem, audience. Really is an engagement that really doesn't happen without all of those parties present in some way.
But Arendt doesn't specify, as you said, specify a time for those readers, lovers of poetry who are incapable of writing a line, to come 100 years later and pick up an Emily Dickinson, for instance, or so forth. So in that sense, we can agree with her. But at the same time, she deliberately, if you go back to that essay, I think it's the essay on revolution, she deliberately wants to take the arts out of the power dialectic conversation, by saying that we have enough evidence in time that what we need is a much better plural democratic conversation in politics, but in arts, the dictatorial or the totalitarian, in a sense, since that was her sort of main bent, is okay because that's the way it works. I don't know what Hannah Arendt would think about Twitter and Facebook, or the idea of the public space being so infiltrated, if you will, to appease the GOP and many others, and also Democrats, with non-essentials, if you will, right? All these immigrants, brownies, blacks, what have you. The idea that there is this notion of globalization and the resistance to it. And so what happens to poetry in an age like this? Because I guess what I want to ask you is, well, some of your poems, some of your books are, one can imagine them much more accessible and have a reciprocal audience than others. And how do you think about that? And we'll talk about a couple of those in particular that I have in mind that actually Anise mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, I would want to contrast my ambition in terms of engagement with the audience to this is an anecdote involving the poet Ted Kooser, a former U.S. poet laureate, and this is not intended, I'm taking a position different than his, it's not intended as a slight against him. But during a visit to our university a few years ago, one of the things that he mentioned was that he has a kind of a test for his poems. He was a business executive. I think he's retired now, but was a kind of high-up business executive in an insurance company. And he said that his test for a poem was that he would read it to his secretary, and if she understood it, then it was okay, and if not, not. And so I want to distance myself from that version of engagement with the audience, which seems to me to make some troubling assumptions about gender, employment, formal education, just a lot of things about who's entitled to understanding, whose understanding is at a high level and whose is not. So I want to distance myself from that and substitute an idea that is much more like offering an alternative criterion. It seems to me that our contemporary American, in my limited experience elsewhere, global culture is suffocating under a kind of singularity of criterion of judgment, that if X increases capital, X is good, and if not, not. And we see it showing up in all our spheres of life. I'm employed in a higher education institution, and everything is about job training, preparing students for the workplace. Are they going to make more money after they get out of school than before they got in school? And why should you go to college? Well, because it's a small investment now, but you'll make more money than your high school friends who didn't. So everything is put into terms of money. And what I want to propose is that poetry is one of the means through which, as are art installations, poetry is one of the means through which we can propose alternative criteria for value judgments, through which we can identify other grounds for making decisions about our lives. And that seems to me to be a very live form of engagement with, among all of us, that doesn't depend exactly on contemporaneity and doesn't depend on my knowing an audience member face to face.
Immediacy.
There can still be an engagement, a live engagement, and a profound engagement. It seems to me to be it's about how we live our lives. It's about who we are, and who we are to one another. And so it seems to me that poetry is one of the places in which we can think of ourselves differently.
I want to go further and maybe be provocative. There is an essay titled "The Regression of Poetry" by a German romanticist named Jouchman or Walkman or Jouchman, I don't know how. But Walter Benjamin unearthed the essay and actually had a longer introduction of the essay than the essay itself. But it's worth a read. It's a fabulous two pieces. And Jouchman says in it essentially that the reason for the regression of poetry is it's a good thing, because it means that there is true human progress. So the idea, sort of a Vichian notion, Vico's notion of the anthropology of poetry as an orality for memory and documentation and communication, is no longer necessary. That much of what happens in poetry today, for example, is actually documented through other means. And that goes straight through Walter Benjamin's art in the age of mechanical reproducibility and so forth. We have cinema, we have the visual arts, and with such intensity that actually we have such human progress to the point where that's the reason, that's the primary reason for the